Heavenly Father, I pray for everyone watching this video right now. May you bless them with peace, joy, and breakthroughs in their lives. Amen. Hello, my wonderful family. I am so glad and grateful to have you here with me today. Your support means the world, and I truly don't take it for granted. Before we dive into today's powerful story, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, drop a comment below to share your thoughts, and of course, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update from this channel. Miss Santos, I'm dying. Clara Santos froze in the doorway of the library, her cleaning supplies balanced precariously in her arms as she stared at the man she'd worked for in silence for 3 years. Thomas Whitmore sat behind his massive oak desk, not looking up from the legal documents spread before him, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss stock portfolios. Sir, 6 weeks, perhaps 8 if I'm fortunate. Though at this point, I'm not certain fortune has anything to do with it. Thomas finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and Clara was startled to see something she'd never noticed before. Not the cold calculation of wealth, but the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying an unbearable weight alone. Clara set down her supplies carefully, her mind racing. In 3 years of cleaning this house, she'd exchanged perhaps 100 words with Thomas Whitmore. He was a ghost who left coffee cups and moved papers, someone who existed in the periphery of her work. She knew he was powerful, wealthy, and completely isolated, but she'd never seen him as simply human. Sir, I'm sorry. I shouldn't be hearing this. You're the only person in this house who looks at me like I'm a human being instead of a bank account. The words stopped Clara cold. She thought about their brief interactions, how she'd always said good morning even when he didn't respond, how she'd learned to work around his schedule rather than demanding he accommodate hers, how she'd occasionally left his coffee a little warmer when she noticed he looked particularly tired. Mr. Whitmore, your family. My family is waiting for me to die so they can fight over my money. My friends are business associates who see my illness as a networking opportunity. My doctors see me as an interesting case study. Thomas stood slowly, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body was betraying him. Do you know what I realized yesterday, Miss Santos? Clara shook her head, unsure why this conversation was happening, but unable to walk away. I realized that I haven't had a genuine conversation with another human being in 5 years. Every interaction in my life is transactional. Every relationship is about what someone wants from me. Clara felt something shifting in her chest, not pity exactly, but recognition. She understood loneliness, though hers came from different circumstances. Working 3 jobs to support her younger sister's education, living in a tiny apartment, having no time for relationships or friendships. She knew what it felt like to be surrounded by people, but fundamentally alone. Sir, what do you want from me? Thomas's smile was self-aware, almost embarrassed. That's exactly the right question, isn't it? What does the dying billionaire want from his maid? Clara waited, sensing that whatever came next would change something between them permanently. I want to ask you for something that will sound completely inappropriate, and I want you to know that you can say no without any consequences to your employment. Clara's heart rate spiked. Mr. Whitmore, I want to ask if you would spend one evening with me. Not working, not cleaning, just talking, like human beings. I want to have one conversation in my remaining weeks that isn't about money or illness or what happens to my estate when I'm gone. Clara stared at him, processing the request. It wasn't what she'd feared, but it was still completely outside the boundaries of their relationship. Why me? Because you're the only person who enters my life who doesn't want anything from me. Because in 3 years, you've treated me with more genuine kindness than anyone else in my world. Because I think you might understand what it's like to be invisible to the people around you. Clara thought about her own isolation, how she moved through the university campus where her sister studied, invisible to the wealthy students whose dorms she cleaned. How she rode buses filled with people who looked through her, worked in houses where families discussed their problems as if she weren't there. Mr. Whitmore, I don't know anything about your world. I wouldn't know what to talk about. Miss Santos, I don't want to talk about my world. I want to talk about yours. I want to know what it's like to work 3 jobs and still smile at people. I want to understand how someone can have so little and still treat others with such grace. Clara felt tears starting, though she wasn't sure why. You notice things about me. You're impossible not to notice. You just live in a world where people choose not to see you. Welcome to a story about the masks we wear to protect ourselves from pain, the walls we build to survive loneliness, and the unexpected grace that happens when two people decide to see each other clearly across impossible divides. Clara thinks she's just a maid being asked an unusual favor, but she's about to discover that sometimes the most powerful thing you can give someone isn't what they have, but what they've never experienced. Clara stood in the library for a long moment, looking at this man she'd worked around for 3 years, but never really seen. Thomas Whitmore wasn't the cold, distant billionaire she'd imagined. He was someone who'd been so successful at protecting his wealth that he'd forgotten how to protect his soul. "One evening," Clara said finally. Just talking. And if I say something stupid about economics or politics, you won't fire me?" Thomas's laugh was the first genuine sound Clara had ever heard from him. "Miss Santos, I've sat through board meetings with people who've made millions saying stupid things about economics and politics. I think I can survive an honest conversation with someone intelligent." "You think I'm intelligent? I think you're the most intelligent person who's worked in this house in years. You just happen to be intelligent about things that matter instead of things that make money." Clara felt something loosening in her chest, a recognition that this strange request might be exactly what they both needed, even if neither of them understood why. "Saturday evening," Clara said. "After I finish my shift." Saturday evening. As Clara picked up her cleaning supplies and headed toward the door, Thomas called after her. "Miss Santos." "Yes, sir?" "Thank you. And please, call me Thomas." Clara turned back to look at him, really look at him, and saw not a billionaire or an employer, but a man who was about to die alone unless someone chose to see him as worth saving. "Clara," she said. "My name is Clara." As she left the library, Clara had no idea that Saturday evening would reveal secrets that would recontextualize everything she thought she knew about Thomas Whitmore, about herself, and about the power of choosing compassion over self-protection. But she was about to discover that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is treat someone with dignity when they least expect it. And sometimes that choice saves more than one life. Clara spent the 3 days between her conversation with Thomas and their planned evening researching everything she could about him. What she found in newspaper articles and business magazines painted a picture of a man she barely recognized. Thomas Whitmore had inherited Whitmore Industries at 25 when his parents died in a plane crash. Over 15 years, he'd transformed a struggling manufacturing company into a technology empire worth billions. But the articles also revealed a pattern of increasing isolation. Fewer public appearances, no romantic relationships lasting more than a few months, and a reputation for being brilliant, but completely detached from the human costs of his business decisions. The most recent articles focused on his illness, pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 4 months ago, prognosis grim. What struck Clara wasn't the medical details, but the tone of the reporting. Even facing death, Thomas was discussed primarily in terms of his wealth and what would happen to his company. "Clara, you're distracted today." Dr. Patricia Mendoza's voice broke through Clara's thoughts as she cleaned the university medical office, where she worked her second job. Patricia was one of the few people who treated Clara like more than invisible help. A kind woman in her 50s who often asked about Clara's sister and remembered details about Clara's life. "Sorry, Dr. Mendoza. Just thinking about something. Want to talk about it? You look like someone wrestling with a difficult decision." Clara paused in her cleaning, considering. Patricia was a psychiatrist who worked with wealthy patients dealing with trauma and addiction. If anyone might understand the complexity of Clara's situation, it would be her. "Dr. Mendoza, if someone very sick asked you to spend time with them, not as a medical professional, but just as a person, would that be appropriate?" Patricia set down her files, her expression shifting to professional concern. "Clara, is someone putting you in an uncomfortable position?" "No, nothing like that. It's just someone who's dying, someone who's very lonely, asked if I would have dinner with them. Just to talk. But there's a significant difference in our circumstances, and I'm not sure if it's appropriate." "What kind of difference?" Clara hesitated. "Economic. Social. Power dynamics." Patricia studied Clara's face carefully. "This is about Thomas Whitmore, isn't it?" Clara's blood ran cold. "How did you?" "Clara, I've been Thomas's psychiatrist for 2 years. I know he's dying, and I know he's profoundly isolated. If he's reached out to you for human connection, that's actually hopeful." Clara sank into a chair, her mind reeling. "You're his doctor?" "I've been trying to help him process his diagnosis and his family relationships." "Clara, Thomas is not dangerous or inappropriate. He's just someone who's facing death and realizing he's never learned how to have authentic relationships. But you can't talk about his case with me. I can't discuss details of his treatment. But I can tell you that someone showing kindness to Thomas right now would be performing an act of genuine mercy. Clara felt something shifting in her understanding. Dr. Mendoza, what's his family situation really like? Patricia was quiet for a moment, clearly considering how much she could ethically share. Let's just say that Thomas's illness has brought out the worst in people who should care about him most. They're fighting over his money. They're treating his remaining time as an inconvenient delay in their inheritance proceedings. Clara thought about Thomas's request, about the exhaustion she'd seen in his eyes. Dr. Mendoza, if I spend time with him, am I helping or enabling some kind of unhealthy dynamic? Clara, if you spend time with him because you genuinely care about his well-being as a human being, you're offering something he desperately needs. If you spend time with him because you feel obligated or because you want something from him, then yes, it becomes problematic. Clara knew her own motivations weren't entirely pure. She was curious about Thomas's world, about what it would be like to have a conversation with someone whose life was so different from hers. But underneath that curiosity was something simpler, compassion for someone who was suffering alone. I think I want to help him, Clara said finally. Not because he's wealthy, but because he's human. Patricia smiled. Then trust your instincts. And Clara? Thomas is lucky to have encountered someone with your integrity. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of autumn chill that made Clara grateful for her worn wool coat. She approached the Whitmore mansion through the main entrance instead of the service door, feeling strange about the change in protocol. Thomas answered the door himself, wearing casual clothes that made him look younger and less intimidating. Without his usual business attire, Clara could see how much weight he'd lost, how the illness was consuming him from the inside. Clara, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I keep my promises. Thomas led her not to the formal dining room where she'd seen him take business meetings, but to a smaller room with comfortable chairs and windows overlooking the garden. A simple meal was laid out on a coffee table. Nothing fancy, just soup and sandwiches that looked like he'd prepared them himself. I thought we might eat here. Less formal. Clara settled into one of the chairs, noting how carefully Thomas moved, how much effort simple actions seemed to require. How are you feeling? Honest answer? Terrible. The treatments are keeping me alive, but making me wish I weren't. But tonight, I feel hopeful for the first time in months. Why? Because I'm having dinner with someone who asked how I'm feeling instead of how my portfolio is performing. They began eating in comfortable silence, and Clara was surprised by how natural it felt. Thomas asked about her sister's studies, about her other jobs, about her plans for the future. His questions were thoughtful, engaged, genuinely interested in her answers. Clara, can I ask you something personal? You can ask. I might not answer. Thomas smiled. Fair enough. How do you maintain hope when circumstances are difficult? I've watched you work for 3 years, and you approach every day with such grace. How do you do that when you're struggling financially? Clara considered the question seriously. I guess because I know my circumstances aren't permanent. My sister will graduate, she'll have opportunities one never had, and our lives will be different. The work I'm doing now has a purpose beyond just survival. You're building something. I'm building her future. And maybe my own eventually. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I've never built anything that wasn't about accumulating more wealth or power. I don't think I know how to build something that matters to people. Your company employs thousands of people. That matters. My company makes technology that helps rich people get richer. It doesn't actually improve anyone's life in any meaningful way. Clara saw something in Thomas's expression that looked like shame. Is that why you're sick? The stress of realizing your life's work hasn't been meaningful. Thomas's laugh was bitter. Clara, I'm sick because sometimes bodies just fail, regardless of how meaningful your life has been. But yes, facing death has made me realize that I've spent 15 years building an empire that will disappear the moment I'm gone, and I'll leave behind nothing that actually mattered. That's not true. What do you mean? Clara thought about the research she'd done, about the articles that had focused only on Thomas's wealth. You've treated me with kindness for 3 years. You've been respectful to every person who works in this house. You notice when people are struggling, and you try to accommodate them. That's basic human decency. Thomas, basic human decency is rarer than you think, especially among people with power. You don't know how many houses I've worked in where wealthy people treated staff like furniture. Thomas looked genuinely surprised. You've worked for other families? Before this job, I worked for the Hendersons for 2 years. They had parties where they discussed their staff's personal lives like entertainment. I've worked for people who left messes deliberately to assert dominance. You've never done anything like that. Clara, the bar for human decency shouldn't be that low. But it is. And the fact that you think it should be higher tells me something important about who you are. Thomas was studying Clara's face with an intensity that made her self-conscious. What? I'm realizing that you see things about people that they don't see about themselves. What do you mean? I mean you just convinced me that my life has had meaning when I was certain it hadn't. Clara felt warmth spreading through her chest. Not romantic attraction, exactly, but the satisfaction of offering comfort to someone who needed it. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway. Thomas's expression immediately shifted to resignation. I should have expected this. What? My family. They must have seen lights on in this part of the house and decided to investigate. The front door opened without anyone knocking, and Clara heard voices in the foyer. Multiple people, talking loudly about funeral arrangements and asset distribution. Thomas. A woman's voice called out. We need to discuss the foundation paperwork. Thomas stood slowly, his face pale with exhaustion and frustration. Clara, I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this. Thomas, are you hiding from your family? I'm avoiding conversations about my death with people who are eager for it to happen. Clara felt anger on Thomas's behalf. Anger at people who would intrude on his remaining time to discuss money and logistics. Mr. Whitmore? The woman appeared in the doorway, elegantly dressed, probably in her 50s, with the kind of controlled expression Clara recognized from dealing with entitled, wealthy people. Oh, I didn't realize you had help here so late. Clara felt the dismissal in the woman's tone, the automatic assumption that Clara was invisible and unimportant. Margaret, this is Clara Santos. Clara, my sister-in-law Margaret. Margaret's eyes widened as she processed the scene. Thomas having dinner with his maid in the family's private quarters. Thomas, we need to talk. Privately. Anything you need to say can be said in front of Clara. Thomas, this is inappropriate. We're here to discuss family business, and you're having some kind of dinner party with the help. Clara felt her face burning with embarrassment and anger. She started to stand, ready to excuse herself and preserve Thomas's relationship with his family. Clara, sit down, Thomas said firmly. Then he turned to Margaret with an expression Clara had never seen before, cold, authoritative, completely in control. Margaret, Clara is my guest. If you can't treat her with respect, you can leave. Thomas, you're not thinking clearly. The medications, the stress, you're making decisions that don't make sense. The decision that doesn't make sense is allowing people who see me as a bank account to control my remaining time. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Thomas, we're family. We love you. You love my money. There's a difference. Clara watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about family dynamics. This was about Thomas's family treating his remaining time as an obstacle to their inheritance. Thomas, Margaret continued, we've prepared papers for you to sign. Medical directives, foundation transfers, estate planning. We need to finalize these while you're still. She glanced at Clara meaningfully. While I'm still competent? Thomas's voice was dangerous. Margaret, I'm dying, not demented. But Thomas, surely you understand that having dinner with staff suggests some confusion about appropriate boundaries. Clara felt the insult land like a physical blow. She wasn't just being dismissed. She was being used as evidence of Thomas's mental incapacity. Margaret, get out of my house. Thomas, get out. All of you. And don't come back unless you're invited. Margaret left, but not before giving Clara a look that made it clear she'd been identified as a problem to be solved. After the family left, Thomas sank back into his chair, visibly drained. I'm sorry you had to witness that. Thomas, I should go. I don't want to cause problems between you and your family. Clara, my family is the problem. You're the first good thing that's happened to me in months. Clara felt something shifting in her chest, not just compassion but protectiveness. Thomas, what were those papers Margaret wanted you to sign? Probably documents that would transfer control of my assets to them immediately, under the guise of medical planning. Can they do that? They can try. And if they can prove I'm mentally incompetent, they might succeed. Clara stared at him, understanding finally why her presence in his home was significant. They're going to use tonight against you, aren't they? As evidence that you're not thinking clearly. Thomas's silence was answer enough. Clara realized with growing horror that her act of kindness toward a dying man had just provided his family with ammunition to destroy him. Clara barely slept that night, replaying Margaret's words and the look of calculated assessment in her eyes. By Monday morning, Clara had convinced herself that she needed to distance herself from Thomas to protect both of them from his family's machinations. That plan lasted exactly until she arrived at the University Medical Center for her morning shift. "Clara, I need to speak with you immediately." Dr. Mendoza's voice was tight with urgency as Clara entered the office suite. "My office. Now." Clara followed Patricia into the private office, noting the closed door and drawn blinds. Patricia's usual warmth was replaced by something that looked like fear. "Clara, what exactly happened at Thomas's house Saturday night? We had dinner and talked. His family showed up uninvited and were rude to both of us." "Why?" Patricia pulled out her phone and showed Clara a news article from the morning business section. "Billionaire's mental health questioned as family seeks conservatorship." Clara's blood turned to ice as she read. The article quoted family sources, expressing concern about Thomas Whitmore's judgment, specifically citing his inappropriate relationship with household staff as evidence of diminished capacity. While Clara wasn't named, the description made her identity obvious to anyone who knew the household. "Patricia, this makes it sound like Thomas is having an inappropriate relationship with his maid, which his family is using as evidence that he's mentally unfit to control his fortune." Patricia's voice was grim. "Clara, this isn't just about Thomas anymore. You've been dragged into a very public legal battle." Clara felt the room spinning around her. "What does this mean for me?" "It means Margaret Whitmore's attorneys are probably already investigating your background, your employment history, your family. Clara, they're going to try to paint you as someone who's taking advantage of a sick, vulnerable man. But that's not what happened. That doesn't matter. What matters is what they can make a court believe happened." Clara thought about her sister Elena, about the scholarship applications pending, about the careful anonymity that had protected their family from scrutiny. "Patricia, my sister, is probably already being investigated. Clara, if Margaret's team can prove that you or your family have benefited financially from your relationship with Thomas, they can use that to support their competency claims." Clara felt panic rising in her chest. "We haven't benefited financially. I haven't taken anything from Thomas except my regular salary." "Can you prove that?" "Bank records, financial statements, documentation that shows no unusual deposits or gifts." Clara nodded, though her confidence was shaking. "Yes, I can prove it. But Patricia, what if they find something that looks suspicious but isn't? What if they twist normal transactions to look like payments?" Patricia was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with professional ethics. "Clara, I need to tell you something that I probably shouldn't." "What?" "Thomas's family has been planning this conservatorship petition for months. They were waiting for any evidence they could use to support their claim that he's mentally incompetent. And I gave them that evidence by having dinner with him. You gave them a narrative they can use. Clara, the truth is that Thomas is absolutely mentally competent. His illness is physical, not cognitive. But grief and isolation can be twisted to look like mental incapacity if you have the right legal team." Clara felt like she was drowning in consequences she'd never anticipated. "What should I do?" "That depends on how much you care about Thomas's well-being." "What do you mean?" Patricia leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Clara, if Thomas loses this conservatorship battle, his family gains control of everything. They'll institutionalize him for his remaining weeks, claiming it's for his own safety. He'll die alone, surrounded by strangers, while they liquidate his assets. Can they really do that? With the right legal strategy and psychiatric evaluation, yes. And Clara, they've already hired Dr. Reginald Hayes to evaluate Thomas's mental capacity." Clara felt her stomach drop. "Who is Dr. Hayes?" "Someone who specializes in finding wealthy patients mentally incompetent when their families pay him enough." Patricia's expression was disgusted. "I've seen Hayes's evaluations before. He has a talent for making normal grief and physical illness look like severe mental deterioration." Clara thought about Thomas's exhaustion, his pain medication, his emotional responses to his family's greed. In the hands of someone looking for evidence of incompetence, those symptoms could be reframed as mental illness. "Patricia, what can I do? I'm just a maid. I don't have lawyers or money or influence. You have something more powerful than that." "What?" "You have the truth. And Clara, you might be the only person who can testify about Thomas's actual mental state with any credibility. Clara felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on her shoulders. You want me to testify in a legal proceeding against a wealthy family with expensive lawyers? I want you to consider whether you're willing to fight for someone who has no one else willing to fight for him. Clara's phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Asterisk Miss Santos, this is Margaret Whitmore. We need to discuss your employment situation and your relationship with my brother-in-law. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Asterisk. Clara showed the message to Patricia, who swore softly. They're not wasting time. What does she want? Probably to offer you money to disappear, or to threaten you into silence. Clara, whatever Margaret offers or threatens, remember that she's fighting for millions of dollars. She'll say or do whatever it takes to win. Clara stared at the message, understanding that responding would pull her deeper into a situation that could destroy her quiet life. But not responding meant abandoning Thomas to people who saw his remaining time as an inconvenience. Patricia, if I get involved in this fight, what are the risks? Worst case? Your name gets dragged through the media, your employment history gets scrutinized, your family gets investigated, and you become a target for people with significant resources and no scruples. And if I don't get involved? A good man dies alone and powerless while his family profits from his suffering. Clara thought about Thomas's face when he'd asked for one evening of genuine conversation, about the loneliness that had driven him to risk his reputation for a few hours of human connection. Patricia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. What? If I fight for Thomas, if I testify about his mental competency, do we have any chance of winning? Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Clara, Margaret has unlimited resources, experienced attorneys, and a psychiatric evaluation that will support her position. You have your word, your integrity, and whatever evidence you can gather about Thomas's actual mental state. That's not an answer. The honest answer is that you're David fighting Goliath. But Clara, sometimes David wins. Clara made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. I'm going to call Margaret back. To agree to meet with her? To tell her that if she wants to fight for Thomas's money, she's going to have to go through me. Patricia smiled for the first time since Clara had arrived. Clara, you might be the bravest person I've ever met. Or the stupidest. In this case, they might be the same thing. Clara dialed Margaret's number, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Margaret Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Clara Santos. You wanted to speak with me. Miss Santos, yes. I think we should meet in person to discuss your situation with my brother-in-law. I don't have a situation with your brother-in-law. I had dinner with someone who was lonely. Miss Santos, I think you misunderstand the seriousness of this matter. Thomas is very ill, and his judgment is compromised. His attachment to you is concerning to his medical team. Clara felt anger flaring. His attachment to me? Mrs. Whitmore, your brother-in-law asked for one evening of conversation with someone who treats him like a human being instead of a bank account. Miss Santos, I understand that you may have developed feelings for Thomas, but you need to understand that any relationship between you is inappropriate and potentially exploitative. The only people exploiting Thomas are his family members who see his illness as an opportunity to seize control of his assets. The silence on the phone was electric. Miss Santos, I think you should be very careful about making accusations you can't support. And I think you should be very careful about underestimating someone who has nothing left to lose. Clara hung up before Margaret could respond, her heart pounding with the realization that she'd just declared war on one of the wealthiest families in the state. How do you feel? Patricia asked, terrified and exhilarated. Good. That means you're fighting for something that matters. Clara's phone immediately rang again. This time it was Thomas. Clara, I just heard from my attorney. My family has filed a conservatorship petition. They're claiming I'm mentally incompetent. I know. I just spoke with Margaret. Clara, I need you to understand something. If you get involved in this fight, they'll try to destroy you. And if I don't get involved, they'll destroy you. I'm dying anyway, Clara. You have a life to protect. Clara thought about her sister, about her careful plans for their future, about the quiet anonymity that had kept them safe. Thomas, what if I told you that some things are worth fighting for, even when you can't win? I'd say you sound like someone who's about to make a very dangerous decision. Then you'd be right. As Clara hung up the phone, she realized that her act of kindness toward a dying billionaire had evolved into something much more complex. a battle for human dignity against institutional greed, a fight that would test everything she believed about justice and courage. But what Clara didn't know yet was that Margaret Whitmore's investigation had already uncovered something about Clara's background that would change the entire nature of their conflict. Because sometimes the people who appear most vulnerable are the ones with the most power to fight back. And sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who have nothing left to lose. Clara arrived at the Whitmore mansion through the service entrance, her heart pounding as she avoided the reporters still stationed at the main gate. Thomas was waiting for her in his study, looking frighlier than she'd seen him, the stress of the legal battle clearly accelerating his physical decline. "Clara, thank God you came. I wasn't sure." Thomas stopped mid-sentence, seeing her expression. "What's wrong?" "Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. Do you remember a construction accident at one of your company's sites about 8 years ago? A building collapse that killed several workers." Thomas's face went pale. "The Riverside project." "Clara, why are you asking about that?" "Because one of the workers who died was named Roberto Santos." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Santos. Clara, was Roberto my father?" Clara's voice was steady despite the tears starting. "Roberto Santos was my father." Thomas sank into his chair as if the weight of the revelation was too much to bear. "Clara, I didn't know. I never made the connection." "Neither did I. Not until Margaret's investigators started digging into my background and found the connection." Clara pulled out a document from her bag. "This is my father's death certificate. And this is the settlement your company paid to my family after his death." Thomas took the papers with shaking hands. "Clara, the settlement. $50,000 for a man's life. Just enough to keep my mother from pursuing a wrongful death lawsuit." "Clara, I remember this case. The investigation found that the building collapse was caused by faulty materials from our subcontractor, not negligence by Whitmore Industries. But you were the one who chose that subcontractor. You were the one who approved the cost-cutting measures that led to using inferior materials." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents. "Yes, I was. Thomas, I need you to understand something. I didn't know who you were when I started working here. I didn't know you were connected to my father's death. But Margaret's team is claiming that I've been planning revenge against you for 8 years. Have you?" The question hung between them like an accusation. Clara looked at this man she'd grown to care about, this man who was dying and alone, and felt everything she thought she knew about herself crumbling. "I don't know," Clara said finally. "Thomas, when I first saw you sitting alone in this house, when I watched you struggle with isolation and illness, part of me felt satisfaction. Like maybe you were finally experiencing consequences for the choices you'd made. And now I don't know if anything I've felt for you has been genuine, or if I've been unconsciously seeking some kind of justice for my father." Thomas stood slowly and walked to the window overlooking his garden. "Clara, what do you remember about your father's death?" "I remember my mother crying for months. I remember moving to a smaller apartment. I remember having to get my first job at 14 to help pay bills." "What do you remember about the legal proceedings?" Clara thought back to that terrible time. "Not much. I was 16. My mother handled everything with lawyers. She just told me that the company had offered a settlement, and we were accepting it." Thomas turned back to face her. "Clara, I need to show you something." Thomas opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick file. "After the Riverside accident, I started keeping detailed records of every safety incident at every Whitmore Industries project. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the families affected." Clara took the file, noting how worn it was, how carefully organized. "Thomas, what is this?" "Evidence of my guilt. Every safety violation, every cost-cutting decision, every choice I made that prioritized profit over human welfare." Thomas's voice was raw with emotion. "Clara, your father's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of negligence that I perpetuated for years." Clara opened the file and saw dozens of incident reports, safety violations, and correspondence with families of injured or killed workers. All documented in Thomas's handwriting, all dated after her father's death. "You've been carrying this guilt for 8 years. I've been trying to figure out how to make amends for 8 years. Clara, the charitable foundations I've been funding, the medical research, the scholarship programs, they're all attempts to atone for the harm my company caused." Clara stared at the documents, seeing her father's case among many others. "Thomas, Why didn't you do more for the families directly affected? Because my lawyers advised against it. They said additional payments could be seen as admissions of guilt that would expose the company to further lawsuits. So you chose to protect your company instead of helping the families who were suffering because of your decisions. I chose to follow legal advice instead of my conscience. Clara, it's one of the biggest regrets of my life. Clara felt anger and compassion warring in her chest. Thomas, do you understand what this means for us? For this legal battle with your family? It means Margaret has evidence that your connection to me isn't coincidental. It means she can claim that your involvement in my life is motivated by revenge rather than genuine care. And is she right? Thomas looked directly into Clara's eyes. Only you can answer that question. Clara's phone buzzed with a call from Margaret Whitmore. She answered it, putting it on speaker so Thomas could hear. Miss Santos, I trust you've had time to consider my offer. Mrs. Whitmore, I've learned some interesting things about my background. Things that change the nature of our conversation. Oh, I'm sure you have. Miss Santos, discovering that your father was killed by negligence at one of Thomas's construction sites must have been quite a shock. Clara felt rage building. How long have you known? Since the day I first investigated your employment with my brother-in-law. Miss Santos, do you really think it's a coincidence that the daughter of a man killed by Whitmore Industries ended up working in Thomas's household? It was a coincidence. Was it? Or did you take that job specifically to get close to the man responsible for your father's death? Clara looked at Thomas, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that your entire relationship with Thomas has been based on deception. That you've been manipulating a sick, guilty man's emotions to extract some kind of revenge or financial compensation. That's not true, isn't it? Miss Santos, you worked for a law firm that handles wrongful death cases. You have training in legal procedures. You positioned yourself in Thomas's household and systematically isolated him from his family. And now you're fighting against a conservatorship that would prevent you from exploiting his guilt and illness. Clara felt the accusations hitting like physical blows. Mrs. Whitmore. Miss Santos, I'm prepared to increase my settlement offer. $1 million for you, full tuition for your sister's education, and a public statement that you were manipulated by grief into inappropriate behavior. All you have to do is testify that Thomas's judgment has been compromised by medication and guilt. Clara looked at Thomas, who was watching her with an expression of resignation and heartbreak. And if I refuse? Then I released to the media documentation showing that you're the daughter of a man killed by Thomas's negligence, that you deliberately sought employment in his household, and that you've been systematically manipulating his emotions for financial gain. Miss Santos, by tomorrow morning, you'll be portrayed as either a victim who deserves sympathy or a predator who deserves prosecution. The choice is yours. Clara hung up the phone and stared at Thomas. She's going to destroy both of us. Clara, there's something else you need to know. What now? Thomas pulled out another document from his desk. The original settlement your family received? It wasn't the only money Whitmore Industries paid related to your father's death. Clara took the document, reading it with growing confusion. Thomas, what is this? It's documentation of an anonymous trust fund that was established for your education. Clara, your college tuition, your sister's scholarship funding. It's been coming from an account I set up after your father died. Clara felt the world spinning around her. You've been paying for our education? I've been trying to honor your father's memory by ensuring his daughters had opportunities he never got to see you achieve. Without telling us. Because I was afraid that if you knew the money came from me, from the company responsible for his death, you'd refuse it. Clara stared at the trust documentation, understanding finally why her scholarship applications had always been mysteriously successful, why Elena's educational funding had always appeared just when they needed it most. Thomas, everything I've accomplished, everything Elena has achieved, it's all been built on money from the company that killed our father. It's been built on your intelligence, your determination, and your sacrifice for your sister's future. The funding just made it possible. Clara felt like she was drowning in the complexity of emotions flooding through her. Gratitude for the opportunities that had shaped her life. Anger at the deception that had hidden the source of those opportunities. Confusion about whether her feelings for Thomas were genuine or unconsciously motivated by their hidden connection. Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. What? When you asked me to have dinner with you, when you said you wanted genuine human connection, Did you know who I was? Thomas was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. I suspected, he said finally. The name Santos, your age, your determination to support your sister's education. It all fit the profile of Roberto Santos's family. But Clara, I wasn't certain until tonight. Clara felt betrayal cutting through her like a blade. So you've been manipulating me from the beginning. I've been hoping that if I could help Roberto Santos's daughter see me as a human being rather than the monster responsible for her father's death, maybe I could find some peace before I die. Clara stared at him, seeing not the lonely billionaire she'd grown to care about, but someone who'd been using her grief and financial desperation to ease his own guilt. Thomas, you've been buying forgiveness from me without telling me what I was forgiving you for. Yes. The simple admission hung between them like a confession that changed everything. Clara stood up, gathering the documents that had revealed the true complexity of their relationship. I need to leave. Clara, please. Thomas, I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I care about you because you're a good person facing death alone, or because you're the man who killed my father, and I'm trying to find some way to make peace with that. Does it matter? Yes, it matters. Because Margaret is right about one thing. I can't fight for your autonomy when I don't understand my own motivations. Clara walked toward the door, then stopped. Thomas, there's something you need to know. What? Whatever happens in this legal battle, whatever I decide to do about Margaret's offer, I'm glad I had dinner with you. For one night, you gave me something I've needed for 8 years without knowing it. What's that? The chance to see the man who killed my father as someone capable of remorse, growth, and genuine care for others. Thomas, that doesn't excuse what happened to my father, but it makes his death feel less senseless. As Clara left the mansion, she realized that her decision about whether to fight for Thomas or accept Margaret's settlement wasn't just about money or legal strategy. It was about whether she could find a way to honor her father's memory while still choosing compassion over revenge. But what Clara didn't know was that her conversation with Thomas had been recorded by Margaret's investigators, and that her admission of conflicted motivations was about to become the centerpiece of Margaret's legal strategy. Because sometimes the truth becomes a weapon in the hands of people who understand how to use it destructively. And sometimes the only way to fight for someone is to risk losing everything you've ever worked to build. The recording was released to the media at 6 a.m. on Thursday morning. Clara woke to her phone ringing incessantly, reporters, lawyers, strangers demanding comment on what the morning news was calling explosive audio evidence of the maid's true motives. The recording of her conversation with Thomas played on every news channel, her voice admitting uncertainty about her own motivations, her acknowledgement that part of her had felt satisfaction seeing Thomas suffer. Clara, you need to see this. Elena stood in their kitchen doorway, her face streaked with tears, holding her laptop. They're saying I'm part of the conspiracy too. Clara looked at the screen, her heart breaking as she read headlines like Sister Scholarship Funded by Blood Money and Family Plot to Defraud Dying Billionaire Exposed. The articles detailed Elena's academic achievements alongside insinuations that her entire education had been orchestrated as part of Clara's alleged revenge scheme. Elena, none of this is your fault. But it's all my education, isn't it? The scholarship money, the opportunities, it all came from him. From the man who killed our father. Clara felt like she was watching Elena's world collapse in real time. Elena, you earned your achievements. The funding just made them possible. How can you say that? Clara, everything I've accomplished is built on money from the company that destroyed our family. How am I supposed to live with that? Before Clara could answer, her phone rang. Dr. Mendoza. Clara, don't come to work today. The university has placed you on administrative leave pending investigation. Clara felt her stomach drop. Investigation of what? Your background, your motivations for working here, whether your employment represents a conflict of interest given your connections to the Whitmore case. Patricia, I'm going to lose my job. Clara, you've probably already lost it. The university can't afford to be associated with this level of scandal. Clara hung up and immediately called her other employer, the cleaning service. The conversation was brief and devastating. They were terminating her employment effective immediately to protect the company's reputation. In the span of one morning, Clara had lost both her jobs, her privacy, and her sister's faith in their shared achievements. Clara, there's something else. Elena's voice was small, defeated. The university called. They're reviewing my scholarship eligibility. Clara felt the last piece of her carefully constructed life crumbling. Elena, No matter what happens, you finish your education. I promise you that. How? With what money? Clara, if they take away my scholarship and you don't have jobs, how do we even pay rent next month? Clara stared at her sister, understanding that Margaret's strategy was working perfectly. Strip away Clara's livelihood, threaten Elena's future, and force Clara to choose between her family's survival and Thomas's autonomy. Clara's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Asterisk Miss Santos, my offer stands until 5 p.m. today. After that, things become much more difficult for your family. Asterisk. Elena, I need to go out for a while. Where? To end this before it destroys you too. Clara found Thomas in his garden, sitting on a bench among the roses his late wife had planted years ago. He looked like he'd aged a decade overnight, the stress and guilt wearing away what little strength he had left. Clara, I heard about your jobs. I'm so sorry. Thomas, we need to talk about ending this fight. Thomas looked up at her with exhaustion and resignation. You want to accept Margaret's offer. I want to protect my sister from consequences she doesn't deserve. And what about protecting me from consequences I do deserve? Clara sat beside him on the bench, noting how carefully he moved, how much effort breathing seemed to require. Thomas, you're dying anyway. Elena has her whole life ahead of her. Clara, if I lose this conservatorship battle, it's not just about my remaining weeks. It's about whether Margaret gains control of assets that fund education for hundreds of students like Elena. But Thomas, if I keep fighting and lose anyway, Elena loses everything and those other students still don't get helped. They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the impossible mathematics of the situation. Clara, I need to tell you something about Margaret's offer. What? It's not real. I mean, the money is real, but the conditions aren't what she's claiming. Clara felt cold dread settling in her stomach. What do you mean? I've seen the actual settlement documents Margaret's attorneys prepared. You would receive the money, but you'd also be signing a non-disclosure agreement that prevents you from ever discussing your father's death, your employment here, or anything related to Whitmore Industries. So if any future investigation into my family's business practices emerges, you'd be legally prevented from testifying about what you know. Clara, Margaret isn't just buying your silence about my mental competency. She's buying your silence about everything. Clara stared at him, including my father's death. Margaret knows that the Riverside Project investigation was flawed. She knows there's evidence of deliberate negligence that was covered up. If that evidence ever surfaces, your testimony would be crucial to any wrongful death prosecution. Clara felt pieces clicking into place. She's not just trying to control your assets. She's trying to eliminate witnesses to past crimes. Margaret has been covering up Whitmore Industries' safety violations for years. Your father's death was just one of many incidents where she helped minimize legal exposure through strategic settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Clara thought about the families affected by those other incidents, about justice denied through legal maneuvering and financial pressure. Thomas, how many families has she silenced? Dozens. Clara, if you sign Margaret's settlement, you're not just abandoning me. You're ensuring that your father's death and the deaths of other workers remain buried forever. Clara felt the weight of impossible choice settling on her shoulders again. Accept the settlement and secure Elena's future, while abandoning justice for her father and other victims. Refuse the settlement and watch Elena's life be destroyed while fighting a legal battle she probably couldn't win. Thomas, there has to be another option. There is. But Clara, you're not going to like it. What? I could change my will to leave everything to charitable foundations, bypassing Margaret entirely. But that would require proving my mental competency in court, which means you'd have to testify about our relationship knowing that your conflicted motivations have been exposed. Clara stared at him. You want me to get on a witness stand and explain to a judge that I care about you despite not knowing if my feelings are genuine or motivated by grief and guilt? I want you to tell the truth about what you've observed regarding my mental state, regardless of your personal motivations for being involved in my life. Clara's phone rang. Elena. Clara, you need to come home. Now. There are people here, legal people, with papers. Clara felt panic rising. What kind of papers? Something about a civil lawsuit. Clara, they're saying you and I are being sued for fraud and conspiracy. Clara hung up and stared at Thomas. Margaret just escalated. What happened? She's filing civil charges against me and Elena. Fraud, conspiracy, probably anything her lawyers think might stick. Thomas struggled to his feet. Clara, I can stop this. I can call Margaret right now, and tell her I'm accepting conservatorship voluntarily. She'll drop all charges against you and your sister, and you'll spend your remaining weeks in an institution while she liquidates your assets. But Elena will be safe. Your family will be protected. Clara looked at this man who was offering to sacrifice his final weeks of autonomy to protect her sister from consequences neither of them deserved. Thomas, I can't let you do that. Clara, you can't sacrifice your sister's future for my pride. It's not about your pride. It's about whether we let Margaret win through intimidation and legal abuse. Thomas moved closer, his voice urgent despite his weakness. Clara, you need to understand something. This fight is going to get worse before it gets better. Margaret has unlimited resources and no ethical constraints. She'll destroy anyone who threatens her control over my assets, including you, especially me. Clara thought about Elena, probably terrified and confused as legal papers were served. About her father, whose death had never received real justice. About Thomas, dying alone while his family fought over his corpse. Thomas, if I keep fighting, what are the chances we actually win? Honestly, maybe 20%. And that's optimistic. And if we lose? If we lose, Elena gets destroyed in the legal proceedings, you face potential criminal charges, and I still end up in Margaret's control anyway. Clara felt like she was drowning in the weight of impossible mathematics. Every choice led to disaster for someone she cared about. Thomas, there's something I need to know. What? If our situations were reversed, if Elena were dying and I had to choose between her autonomy and your sister's future, what would you want me to do? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I'd want you to save your sister. Clara nodded, understanding finally what she had to do. Then that's what I'm going to do. Clara pulled out her phone and dialed Margaret's number. Mrs. Whitmore, I accept your offer. All of it. The money, the non-disclosure agreement, the testimony about Thomas's mental state. Miss Santos, I'm so glad you've come to your senses. I'll have my attorneys prepare the final documents. But I have one condition. Miss Santos, you're not in a position to negotiate conditions. I am if you want my cooperation instead of my resistance. Mrs. Whitmore, you drop all legal action against my sister. Elena had nothing to do with any of this, and she doesn't deserve to have her life destroyed because of my choices. Done. Miss Santos, you've made the right decision. Clara hung up and looked at Thomas, who was watching her with something that looked like both heartbreak and pride. Clara, are you sure about this? I'm sure that Elena deserves a future, and that watching you fight for your autonomy doesn't justify destroying hers. And what about justice for your father? Clara thought about Roberto Santos, about the family he'd never gotten to see grow up because of negligence and greed. Maybe some fights can't be won by the people who start them. Maybe sometimes justice has to wait for the next generation to find better ways to fight. As Clara prepared to abandon Thomas to his family's greed in order to protect her sister's future, she felt something dying inside her chest. Not just hope for justice, but faith in the possibility that doing the right thing would lead to right outcomes. But as she walked away from the garden where she'd made the hardest decision of her life, Clara didn't know that her conversation with Thomas had been witnessed by someone who would change everything. Someone who understood that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from fighting impossible battles, but from knowing when to surrender them. And someone who was about to prove that Margaret Whitmore had made a crucial mistake in underestimating the power of a dying man's final act of defiance. Clara signed the settlement documents in Margaret's attorney's office at 4:47 p.m., her hand shaking as she wrote her name on papers that would secure Elena's future and bury her father's memory forever. The non-disclosure agreement was 47 pages of legal language that essentially erased Clara's right to ever speak about anything she'd witnessed or experienced related to the Whitmore family. Miss Santos, you've made the wise choice, Margaret said, sliding a cashier's check across the mahogany conference table. $1 million as promised. Your sister's education is secure, and this unfortunate situation can finally be resolved. Clara stared at the check, more money than she'd ever imagined holding, enough to transform everything about their lives. But looking at it felt like staring at her father's gravestone. Mrs. Whitmore, when do I testify about Thomas's mental state? Tomorrow morning. The judge has agreed to an expedited hearing given Thomas's declining health. Margaret's smile was triumphant. Your testimony about his impaired judgment and inappropriate behavior will be the final evidence needed to grant conservatorship. Clara nodded, though something in her chest felt like it was being slowly crushed. And after that, You and your sister disappear from public view. No interviews, no statements, no contact with Thomas or anyone associated with this case. Clara stood to leave, the settlement documents and check heavy in her bag. Mrs. Whitmore, can I ask you something? What? Do you ever think about the families affected by your decisions? The people whose lives get destroyed when you manipulate legal systems for financial gain. Margaret's expression didn't change. Miss Santos, I think about protecting my family's interests and ensuring that unstable individuals don't make decisions that affect thousands of employees and shareholders. And if those unstable individuals are actually the most ethical people involved, then they're especially dangerous and need to be stopped. Clara left the law office feeling like she'd sold more than her testimony. She'd sold her soul. But as she walked toward her car, she noticed someone sitting on a bench across the street, someone who made her heart stop. Elena. Clara's sister stood up as Clara approached, her young face set with a determination Clara had never seen before. Elena, what are you doing here? How did you? I followed you. Clara, I heard your conversation with Thomas in the garden. I heard everything. Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Elena, you shouldn't have. I heard you agree to destroy an innocent man's life to protect mine. Clara, how could you think I would want that? Elena, you don't understand the stakes. I understand that you just signed away our father's memory to save my education. I understand that you sacrificed everything you believe in because you think I'm too weak to handle the consequences of fighting for what's right. Clara stared at her sister, seeing not the 19-year-old girl she'd been protecting, but a young woman whose moral clarity put Clara's own choices to shame. Elena, Margaret has unlimited resources. She can destroy your future. So what? Clara, do you think Dad would want his death covered up to protect my college education? Do you think he'd want the man responsible for other workers' deaths to be silenced so I could have a comfortable life? Clara felt tears starting. Elena, I was trying to honor his memory by giving you the opportunities he never got to see you achieve. You want to honor his memory? Then don't let the people responsible for his death by your silence with money stolen from workers' families. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. Clara, while you were signing those papers, I was doing research. What kind of research? I found 12 other families who lost workers in Whitmore Industries accidents over the past decade. Families who were paid settlements and forced to sign non-disclosure agreements by Margaret Whitmore. Clara took the folder, scanning documents that painted a picture of systematic negligence covered up through legal intimidation and financial pressure. Elena, where did you get these? From families who are willing to break their non-disclosure agreements if someone is brave enough to help them expose the truth. Clara, Margaret doesn't just silence individuals. She silences entire communities of people who've lost loved ones to corporate negligence. Clara stared at the documents, understanding finally that her choice to protect Elena had played directly into Margaret's larger strategy of covering up decades of safety violations and wrongful deaths. Elena, if these families speak out, they could face legal consequences for breaking their agreements. And if they stay silent, more workers die in preventable accidents while Margaret continues covering up safety violations for profit. Clara's phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Clara, I know what you've done and why you did it. Thank you for choosing Elena's future over my pride. I love you for that choice, even though it breaks my heart. Clara showed the message to Elena, who read it with tears in her eyes. Clara, do you see what you're doing to him? He's thanking you for betraying him because he loves you enough to want you to save me. Elena, what choice do I have? Margaret's attorneys are expecting me to testify tomorrow morning. You have the choice to tell the truth instead of the lie you agreed to tell. And if I do that, Margaret destroys both our lives and Thomas still loses his autonomy. Elena was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone. Clara, what if Margaret couldn't destroy our lives because we'd already given up everything she could threaten to take away? What do you mean? Elena showed Clara her phone screen. I just withdrew from the university and forfeited my scholarship. Clara stared at her sister in shock. Elena, what have you done? I've eliminated Margaret's leverage over us. Clara, she can't threaten my education if I've already given it up voluntarily. Elena, you've worked so hard. And I can work hard again at a different school, with clean money, after we've finished fighting for Dad's memory and Thomas's autonomy. Clara felt something breaking open in her chest. Not despair, but a recognition of courage she'd never seen in herself. Elena, if we fight Margaret and lose, we could end up with nothing. If we don't fight, we'll end up with everything built on blood money and covered-up deaths. Clara, which version of nothing can you live with? Clara looked at her sister, brilliant, determined Elena, who'd just sacrificed her immediate future to preserve their family's integrity, and realized that she'd been protecting the wrong thing. Elena, if we do this, if we break the settlement and fight back, there's no guarantee we win. But there's a guarantee that we'll be fighting for something that matters. Clara pulled the settlement documents and cashier's check from her bag. Elena, are you absolutely sure about this? I'm sure that Dad didn't die so we could profit from covering up other families' grief. Clara tore up the check and the settlement documents, scattering the pieces in the wind like confetti celebrating their decision to choose principle over survival. Elena, we're about to become very poor and very vulnerable. We're about to become very free and very dangerous to people who profit from other people's silence. Clara's phone rang. Margaret Whitmore. Miss Santos, I just received word that your sister has withdrawn from university. What exactly do you think you're accomplishing? I'm accomplishing the elimination of your leverage over my family's future. Miss Santos, you signed a binding agreement. If you don't testify as agreed tomorrow morning, I'll sue you for breach of contract and fraud. Sue away, Mrs. Whitmore. Elena and I just eliminated everything you could take from us in a lawsuit. Miss Santos, you're making a terrible mistake. No, Mrs. Whitmore. The terrible mistake was thinking that my family's integrity was for sale. Clara hung up and looked at Elena, who was smiling with the kind of fearless joy Clara hadn't seen since their father was alive. Elena, we just declared war on one of the wealthiest families in the state while having no money, no jobs, and no legal representation. Clara, we just declared war on behalf of Dad and every other worker who died because of preventable accidents that were covered up for profit. Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that she was doing the right thing regardless of the personal cost. Elena, what do we do now? Now we call the families I found and ask them to stand with us. Now we call Thomas and tell him he's not facing this alone anymore. Now we prepare to tell a judge the truth about everything we've witnessed and experienced. As Clara and Elena walked toward their car, ready to fight a battle they probably couldn't win against opponents with unlimited resources, Clara realized something profound. Her choice to protect Elena had taught Elena to protect others. Her willingness to sacrifice her principles had inspired Elena to defend principles worth sacrificing for. And her decision to surrender had created the conditions for Elena to choose courage over safety. Elena, Clara said as they drove toward Thomas's house, I love you for giving up your education to fight for strangers. I love you for being willing to sacrifice everything to protect me, even when I didn't deserve that kind of protection. You deserved better than a sister who would sell her soul to buy your future. I deserved a sister who would teach me that some things are more important than personal security. And Clara? That's exactly what you did. As they pulled into Thomas's driveway, ready to tell him that he wouldn't face tomorrow's court hearing alone, Clara realized that sometimes the most powerful victories come not from avoiding defeat, but from choosing the right way to lose. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't protection from hard choices, but the opportunity to make those choices with courage and integrity. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when Clara and Elena arrived the next morning. What should have been a routine conservatorship hearing had transformed into something resembling a major trial, with reporters, family members of Whitmore Industries victims, and supporters who'd driven from across the state to witness what many were calling a reckoning decades in the making. Thomas sat at the defendant's table looking friendlier than Clara had ever seen him, but his eyes held a clarity and determination that belied Margaret's claims of mental incompetence. When he saw Clara and Elena enter, his face lit up with something that looked like hope reborn. Miss Santos, Judge Richardson called, you're scheduled to testify about Mr. Whitmore's mental capacity. Are you prepared to proceed? Clara stood, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Yes, Your Honor, but I need to make something clear. My testimony will be the complete truth, not the version I was paid to present. Margaret's attorney shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Miss Santos signed a settlement agreement that included specific testimony requirements. Your Honor, Clara said, her voice carrying across the packed courtroom. I tore up that settlement agreement yesterday when I realized that accepting money to lie about a dying man's mental state would make me complicit in fraud. Judge Richardson raised an eyebrow. Miss Santos, are you saying you were paid to provide false testimony? Yes, Your Honor. I was offered $1 million to testify that Thomas Whitmore's judgment is impaired by illness and medication. The truth is that Mr. Whitmore's mental faculties are completely intact, and his family is using the conservatorship process to steal his assets while he's too sick to defend himself effectively. The courtroom erupted in whispers as Margaret's attorney objected frantically, but Judge Richardson was already taking notes. Miss Santos, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support your claims? Before Clara could answer, the courtroom doors opened and Dr. Patricia Mendoza walked in, carrying a briefcase that Clara somehow knew contained something explosive. Your Honor, Dr. Mendoza announced. I'm Dr. Patricia Mendoza, Mr. Whitmore's treating psychiatrist, and I have evidence relevant to this proceeding. Margaret's face went pale as Dr. Mendoza approached the bench. Your Honor, for the past year, I've been documenting a pattern of conservatorship abuse perpetrated by Margaret Whitmore. This case is not an isolated incident. It's part of a systematic scheme to seize control of elderly and ill family members' assets through fraudulent competency challenges. Dr. Mendoza opened her briefcase and pulled out files that made Margaret's attorney visibly panic. Your Honor, I have documented evidence of 7 previous conservatorship cases where Margaret Whitmore used identical tactics. Hiring psychiatric evaluators known for finding wealthy patients incompetent, manipulating family dynamics to isolate the target, and pressuring witnesses to provide false testimony about mental capacity. Clara watched Margaret's composed facade cracking as the scope of the evidence became clear. Furthermore, Dr. Mendoza continued, I have recordings of conversations where Mrs. Whitmore explicitly discussed using Mr. Whitmore's illness to gain control of his assets, with no regard for his actual mental state or well-being. Your Honor, Margaret's attorney interrupted, these allegations are about to be supported by additional evidence, Judge Richardson said grimly. Dr. Mendoza, please proceed. Your Honor, yesterday evening I was contacted by 12 families who were victims of Mrs. Whitmore's previous conservatorship schemes. They're prepared to testify about how she systematically isolated vulnerable family members, manipulated medical evaluations, and used the legal system to commit what essentially amounts to elder abuse on a massive scale. Clara looked around the courtroom, seeing faces she recognized from Elena's research. Families who'd lost loved ones to Whitmore Industries accidents, families who'd been silenced by non-disclosure agreements, families who'd been waiting years for an opportunity to speak truth to power. Your Honor, Dr. Mendoza said, her voice growing stronger, Margaret Whitmore has been operating what can only be described as a criminal enterprise, using conservatorship laws to systematically loot the assets of elderly and ill family members. Margaret finally found her voice. Your Honor, these accusations are completely unfounded. Are they? Thomas Whitmore stood slowly, his voice weak, but carrying clearly across the silent courtroom. Your Honor, may I present evidence of my own? Thomas pulled out a recording device that Clara recognized, the same type he'd used during their dinner conversations. Your Honor, for the past 6 months, I've been recording my interactions with my family members. I did this because I suspected they were planning to have me declared incompetent, and I wanted documentation of my actual mental state. Thomas pressed play, and Margaret's voice filled the courtroom. Thomas is dying anyway. We just need to speed up the process of gaining control before he gives away any more money to those ridiculous charities. The courtroom was dead silent as more recordings played. Margaret discussing strategies for isolating Thomas, conversations about hiring psychiatric evaluators who would find him incompetent regardless of his actual condition, and explicit discussions about liquidating his assets immediately after gaining conservatorship. Your Honor, Thomas continued, these recordings document not just my family's plans to steal my assets, but their complete disregard for my well-being during my final weeks of life. Clara felt tears starting as she listened to Thomas's evidence. Months of carefully documented conversations that proved not only his mental competency, but the calculated cruelty of his family's scheme. But Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice growing stronger, the most important evidence isn't these recordings. It's standing right here in this courtroom. Thomas gestured toward Clara and Elena, then toward the families who'd come to support them. These people represent something my family doesn't understand, the principle that human dignity matters more than financial gain. Miss Santos could have accepted $1 million to lie about my mental state. Instead, she chose to forfeit that money and risk everything to tell the truth. Thomas looked directly at Clara. Your Honor, Miss Santos has demonstrated more integrity and courage in the past week than my family has shown in 5 years of my illness. If this court needs evidence of sound judgment, it should look not at my medical records, but at the people who've chosen to stand with truth against power. Clara felt something swelling in her chest as she looked around the courtroom. At Elena, who'd sacrificed her education to fight for strangers. At Dr. Mendoza, who'd risked her professional reputation to expose systematic abuse. At the families who'd broken their non-disclosure agreements to seek justice for their loved ones. Your Honor, Clara said, stepping forward, I need to say something else. Proceed, Miss Santos. I am the daughter of Roberto Santos, who was killed in a Whitmore Industries construction accident 8 years ago. My involvement in Mr. Whitmore's life began as his employee, but it continued because I recognized someone who was genuinely trying to atone for past mistakes. Clara's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Mr. Whitmore could have hidden his company's responsibility for my father's death. Instead, he spent 8 years documenting safety violations, funding victim compensation, and trying to use his wealth to prevent other families from experiencing what mine did. Clara looked at Margaret, whose face had gone ashen. Your Honor, Margaret Whitmore has spent decades covering up workplace deaths and silencing victim families through legal intimidation. Thomas Whitmore has spent recent years trying to make amends for those same deaths through charitable giving and safety improvements. Clara felt the power of truth flowing through her voice. If this court needs to determine who's mentally competent to control billions of dollars, it should ask which approach represents sound judgment, covering up harm for profit, or accepting responsibility and working to prevent future harm. Judge Richardson was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the evidence and recordings. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of moral authority. This court finds that not only is Thomas Whitmore mentally competent to manage his affairs, but that the conservatorship petition represents a fraudulent attempt to seize assets through manipulation of legal processes. The courtroom erupted in cheers as Judge Richardson continued. Furthermore, this court is referring evidence of criminal conservatorship fraud to the district attorney for immediate investigation. Mrs. Whitmore, you are hereby ordered to cease all attempts to control Mr. Whitmore's assets and to submit to investigation of your previous conservatorship activities. Clara felt Elena's hand slip into hers as they watched Margaret being led from the courtroom by investigators who'd apparently been waiting outside. But the most powerful moment came when Thomas stood and walked slowly toward Clara, his eyes bright with tears and gratitude. Clara, you saved my life. Not from illness, I'm still dying. But you saved my life from ending in powerlessness and isolation. Thomas, you saved mine too. You showed me that wealth can be used for justice instead of just comfort. As they embraced, Clara felt something she'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she'd chosen correctly, regardless of personal cost. Clara, Elena whispered, look. Clara turned to see the families who'd supported them gathering around, but they weren't celebrating a legal victory. They were planning something larger. Dr. Mendoza approached with obvious excitement. Clara, Elena, Thomas, the families want to establish a foundation. An organization that helps other families fight conservatorship fraud and workplace safety violations. Clara stared at her. A foundation? Funded by Thomas's assets, managed by Clara's financial skills, and dedicated to preventing other families from experiencing what all of you have endured. Thomas smiled, and Clara saw in his expression the peace of someone who'd found a way to transform suffering into purpose. Clara, would you consider managing a foundation that fights for workers' safety and families' rights? It would mean using everything you've learned about economics and law to help people who don't have resources to fight for themselves. Clara looked around the courtroom, at Elena, whose sacrifice had made this victory possible, at Dr. Mendoza, whose courage had exposed systematic abuse, at the families whose willingness to break their silence had created justice for everyone. Thomas, I can't think of anything I'd rather do with my life. As Clara prepared to transform from a maid fighting for one man's dignity into an advocate fighting for economic justice on behalf of working families everywhere, she realized that her father's death had finally found its meaning. Not in money or settlements or legal victories, but in the creation of systems that would prevent other daughters from losing their fathers to preventable accidents covered up by corporate greed. And in the proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't wealth or connections or legal expertise. Sometimes it's just the courage to tell the truth when telling the truth costs everything you have. 3 months later, Clara stood in the conference room of the newly established Santos Foundation for Workers' Rights and Family Protection, watching Elena present their quarterly impact report to a room full of labor advocates, safety inspectors, and families who'd benefited from their legal assistance program. In our first quarter of operation, Elena announced with the confidence of someone who'd found her true calling, "We've helped 43 families challenge fraudulent conservatorship proceedings, forced safety improvements at 12 construction sites, and provided legal representation to workers' families in 8 wrongful death cases." Clara felt a surge of pride watching her sister, who'd not only re-enrolled in university, but had also become the Foundation's Director of Family Services. Elena's choice to sacrifice her original education had led her to something far more meaningful, using her intelligence to protect vulnerable people from the kind of exploitation their own family had endured. Clara, Dr. Mendoza approached with a gentle smile. As the Foundation's medical ethics director, Patricia had helped them develop protocols for identifying and preventing conservatorship abuse. "Thomas is asking for you." Clara found Thomas in his private office, surrounded by legal documents and Foundation reports. At his insistence, he'd been working reduced hours, but every day he came in was a day spent fighting for the principles that had given his final months meaning. "Clara, I need to show you something." Thomas handed her a letter bearing the letterhead of the Department of Justice. "Read it." Clara scanned the document, her eyes widening as she processed its contents. "Thomas, this says that Margaret's investigation has uncovered similar conservatorship fraud schemes in 17 other states, and that our case has inspired a federal task force dedicated to protecting elderly and disabled individuals from financial exploitation." Clara sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what their fight had accomplished. How many people are we talking about? Thousands of families who were systematically robbed of their autonomy and assets. "Clara, what started as my family trying to steal my money has become a national conversation about elder abuse and legal reform." Clara thought about the ripple effects of their decision to fight back. Families across the country finding courage to challenge abusive conservatorship, safety advocates using their case as precedent for holding corporations accountable, law students studying their legal strategy in classes about justice and civil rights. "Thomas, do you ever regret asking me to have dinner with you that first night?" Thomas's smile was gentle, peaceful. "Clara, that dinner was the beginning of the most meaningful period of my life. For 35 years, I accumulated wealth without understanding what wealth was for. In 3 months, you've taught me that money is only powerful when it's used to protect people who can't protect themselves." Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she thought about Thomas's declining health. The cancer was winning, as they'd always known it would. But the man facing death now was completely different from the isolated billionaire she'd first encountered. "How are you feeling today?" "Tired. Grateful. Ready." Thomas's honesty about his condition had become one of the things Clara most valued about their relationship. "Clara, I need to ask you something." "What?" "After I'm gone, will you continue this work? Not because you feel obligated, but because you believe in what we're building." Clara thought about the families they'd helped, about the workers whose safety had been improved because of their advocacy, about the legal precedents they'd established that would protect future victims of financial exploitation. "Thomas, this foundation has become more important to me than any job I've ever had. But I need you to know something." "What?" "I'm not continuing this work to honor your memory, though I will honor your memory. I'm continuing it because fighting for justice has become who I am." Thomas's expression shifted to something that looked like profound satisfaction. "Clara, do you understand what you just said? That I found my calling? That you found yourself? Clara, 3 months ago you were someone who survived by being invisible. Today you're someone who changes systems by being unmistakably present." Clara felt the truth of his observation settling around her like a comfortable weight. She thought about the congressional testimony she'd given the previous week, about the families who called her for advice, about the lawyers who sought her consultation on complex conservatorship cases. "Thomas, I never imagined that accepting your dinner invitation would lead to testifying before Congress. I never imagined that asking my maid for conversation would lead to discovering what my life was actually for." They sat together in comfortable silence, both understanding that their relationship had transcended its original boundaries to become something neither of them had anticipated. Not romance, exactly, but a partnership in purpose that had transformed them both. "Clara," Thomas said finally, "there's something I need to tell you about your father." Clara felt her heart rate increase. What about him? Thomas pulled out a file she'd never seen before. I've been working with investigators to fully document the safety violations that led to Roberto's death. Clara, we've found evidence that the building collapse wasn't just negligence. It was the direct result of Margaret's cost-cutting decisions. Clara took the file with shaking hands. What kind of evidence? Engineering reports that Margaret suppressed, safety inspections she falsified, and communications showing that she knew the materials were substandard, but approved their use anyway to increase profit margins. Clara stared at the documents, understanding that her father's death had been even more preventable than she'd realized. Thomas, can this evidence be used to prosecute Margaret? It already has been. Clara, Margaret was indicted yesterday on charges of criminal negligence in your father's death and the deaths of 6 other workers. Clara felt tears starting, not just grief for her father, but relief that his death would finally receive the justice it deserved. Will the families receive compensation? Full compensation, plus punitive damages. Clara, the settlement will be large enough to fund additional foundations like ours in other states. Clara felt the scope of what they'd accomplished beginning to crystallize. Their fight for Thomas's autonomy had exposed a network of corruption that reached far beyond one family's greed, creating justice for victims and protection for future targets of similar schemes. Thomas, do you think my father would be proud of what we've built? Clara, I think your father would be amazed that his daughter transformed his death into a foundation that will prevent other daughters from experiencing the same loss. Elena appeared in the doorway, her face bright with excitement. Clara, Thomas, you need to see the news. Elena turned on the television, where a reporter was standing outside the federal courthouse. Today marks a historic victory for workers' rights advocates, as the Santos Foundation's legal strategy has been adopted by the Department of Labor as a national model for preventing workplace safety violations. Clara watched in amazement as the reporter continued. The foundation, established by former Whitmore Industries made Clara Santos and billionaire Thomas Whitmore, has successfully challenged corporate safety practices in 12 states and helped pass new federal protections for workers' families. Clara, Elena said, her voice filled with pride, they're calling you one of the most effective labor advocates in the country. Clara felt the surreal satisfaction of seeing her name associated with meaningful change rather than scandal and gossip. Thomas, she said, do you remember what you told me the first night we had dinner? About wanting to have one conversation that wasn't about money or illness or death. I remember. We ended up having hundreds of conversations that were about the most important things imaginable: justice, purpose, and how to use whatever power we have to protect people who need protection. Thomas's smile was radiant despite his obvious fatigue. Clara, you gave me something I thought was impossible. What? You gave me a death worth dying. Not because I'm leaving money behind, but because I'm leaving systems that will continue fighting for justice long after I'm gone. Clara felt the weight of loss settling over her, knowing that Thomas's time was measured in weeks rather than months. But alongside the grief was gratitude for the transformation their unlikely friendship had created. Thomas, there's something I need you to know. What? I love you. Not romantically, but as the person who saw potential in me that I didn't know existed. You changed my life by believing I was capable of changing yours. Clara, you saved my soul by showing me what wealth is actually for. As Clara prepared to leave the office that evening, she found Elena waiting by the elevator, holding an envelope. What's that? My acceptance letter to law school. I'm starting next fall, specializing in workers' rights and family protection law. Clara felt her heart swell with pride. Elena, that's perfect. Clara, I want you to know something. Everything that's happened, losing Dad, struggling financially, watching you sacrifice for my education, all of it led to this moment where I know exactly what I want to do with my life. Which is, continue the work we've started here. Make sure that families like ours never again have to choose between justice and survival. As they drove home to the modest apartment they still shared, despite the foundation salary that could have afforded them much more, Clara realized that their journey from poverty to purpose had taught her something profound about wealth. Money was only powerful when it was used to create justice. Security was only meaningful when it was shared with people who needed protection. And love, real love, wasn't about finding someone who completed you, but about finding people who inspired you to become who you were meant to be. 2 weeks later, Clara held Thomas's hand as he died peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by foundation staff, families they'd helped, and workers whose safety had been protected because of their advocacy. His last words were a whispered thank you that carried the weight of gratitude for a life that had finally found its meaning. At Thomas's funeral, Clara spoke to a congregation that included Supreme Court justices, labor leaders, and dozens of families who'd been saved from conservatorship fraud through their foundation's work. Thomas Whitmore asked me to spend one evening with him because he was lonely, Clara said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church. That evening became a partnership that proved wealth can be a force for justice when it's guided by conscience rather than greed. Clara looked out at the faces of people whose lives had been changed by Thomas's transformation from isolated billionaire to fierce advocate for vulnerable families. Thomas left behind more than money. He left behind proof that it's never too late to choose justice over comfort, courage over safety, and purpose over profit. After the service, Clara found herself back at the fountain where she'd first encountered the man she'd thought was a homeless beggar. Elena sat beside her, both of them quiet in the gathering dusk. Clara, what happens now? Now we continue the work. We help more families, we change more laws, we build more protection for people who need advocates. And personally, what happens to Clara Santos? Clara thought about the question, about the woman she'd become through the crucible of fighting for justice against impossible odds. Clara Santos becomes someone who uses every skill, every connection, and every resource she has to make sure that no family has to choose between survival and speaking truth to power. Clara's phone buzzed with a call from a familiar number, Dr. Mendoza. Clara, we have 17 new cases this week. Families who heard about our work and need help challenging conservatorship abuse. I'll be there Monday morning. As Clara and Elena walked home through streets they'd traveled as struggling women just trying to survive, Clara realized that their story had become something larger than she'd ever imagined possible. It had become proof that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't anger or despair, but the decision to transform suffering into systems that prevent other people from suffering in the same way. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do is treat someone with dignity when they least expect it, because that choice can change not just their life, but the lives of everyone they touch afterward. 3 months later, Clara received a letter that made her smile through tears of recognition. Dear Ms. Santos, my name is Maria Gonzalez, and I work as a home health aide for an elderly man whose family is trying to have him declared incompetent so they can control his assets. I read about your foundation in the newspaper, and I'm hoping you can help us. I know it sounds familiar. A worker who cares about her employer facing people who see both of us as obstacles to their inheritance. But Ms. Santos, this man is completely mentally competent, and his family is using the legal system to steal from him while he's vulnerable. I don't have money for lawyers or experience fighting wealthy families. But I have something else, the certainty that what's happening to him is wrong, and the willingness to risk everything to stop it. Can you help us? Sincerely, Maria Gonzalez. Clara picked up her phone and dialed Maria's number, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that had defined her life since that first dinner with Thomas. Maria, this is Clara Santos. Yes, we can help you. And Maria, you're exactly the kind of person our foundation was created to support. As Clara began planning another battle against conservatorship fraud, she realized that Thomas's legacy wasn't just the foundation or the legal precedents or the families they'd saved. His legacy was the proof that every person has the power to choose courage over comfort, and that those choices ripple outward in ways that change the world for generations. What did this story teach you about the courage it takes to fight for justice even when you have everything to lose, and the power that comes from seeing people's humanity across divides of wealth and circumstance? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world. 6 months after Thomas's death, the Santos Foundation received an anonymous donation of $50 million with a note. For Maria Gonzalez and all the other workers who choose courage over silence. The fight for dignity continues. The note was signed only with initials, TW. But Thomas Whitmore was dead. Or was he? Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose to disappear from their old lives to build something entirely new. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't money or security. It's the inspiration to become someone worth being. But that's a story for another day.